Thank you so much for being here. It's amazing to see so many faces. It's slowly kind of building the crowd as we go through the COVID experience. So first of all, I would like to thank the Clark Institute and everybody else that made possible and has made possible, continues to make possible for me to be here and to give me an opportunity to study, research, and think in peace. Also, I would like to thank Irene Small, Roberto Condur, and Tumelo Musaka for the generous exchange. It's been really a good fortune to coincide with them, and it's been wonderful to share with all the fellows. So, more than discussing the content of this coming book, this presentation is an attempt to delineate the ethos of the project and introduce an incipient possible structure for a community of voices and subjects to come together. First of all, I need to state categorically that decoloniality is not new and that it is not reducible to discourse within academic disciplines. A decolonial impulse has existed from the first moment colonization began through the resistance and survival to colonialism by indigenous and African people, and subsequently for a long history of resilience, creation, and reinvention of the self and culture from the survival and transformation of their own cultures and modes of being. The reason why ethos is the guiding principle of this project is because of the colonial art history, as Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui points out regarding the colonial agenda as a whole, in the context of today's widespread discourses of colonization, decolonization in academic circle can easily become a new academic canon, catering to the economy of neoliberal universities, divorced from the communities it could be serving and be relevant. So to work on a book which focuses on race, ethnicity, gender, and popular culture, it's very easy to reproduce taxonomies of classification and therefore perpetuate insularity that has made the marginalization actually possible in the first place. And this is the reason why the ethos is so important and is so complicated to actually work through the way that I can actually frame the multiple voices of the book. The images on the screen reveal the dialogical nature of this project, which is about the embodiment by real subjects and their lives and art in complex processes of the resilience and reinvention in the face of colonialism. They illustrate the dialogical idea of embodiment and weaving in the title of this lecture, whereby the body is entangled in the creative act of living and creating while undoing colonialism. This project is about weaving organic and dialogical stories with the thread that are usually absent: Africa, indigeneity, gender, and popular culture, with an expanded hemispheric framework of Latin American and Latinx art in the 20th and 21st century. Further along, I will explain why I include Latinx art here. So the image on your right, on your left actually, is Felipe Wampoma de Ayala, who was actually a Quechua nobleman known for chronicling and denouncing the ill treatment of the natives of the Andes by the Spanish after the conquest. So as you can see, it explains what it says, but the description continues. They beat them, women, and do not pay. In the Doctrina, the parish, the Doctrina Padres compel widows and single women to spin and weave, accusing them of having lovers as an excuse for making them work without paying them. In this way, Indian women become whores and there is no remedy. To this denunciatory image, where colonialists deployed a strategy of submission, exploitation, and dehumanization of women, we may see in the image next door by Maria Vela Marmolejo, Anonymous Tools, from 1982, a private performance at the edges of Rio Cauca, which was also created during the time of the violent civil war in Colombia, that embodies the resilience and creative survival. She writes about this work. This is a ritual to the Mother Earth, was produced as an act of forgiveness for the pollution and destruction of the flora and fauna. The performance, which lasted 15 minutes, consisted in a healing ritual where, having covered partially her body with surgical tape and gauze covering her face, Marmolejo drew a spiral with quicklime, and in the center placed a toilet bowl where she did a vaginal wash, letting her fluids fall to the ground fertilizing thus the earth that had been polluted, and fragments of the soaked tape and gauze were arranged in the soil. The performance is a healing ritual that highlights the role of the female body and sensibility in the processes of survival and creation of a present and a future. The gauze, a loosely woven, almost translucent fabric used to bandage wounds, bandages the body and the land. And the indigenous women today are still weaving, not simply fabrics, but a myriad of other forms, but are weaving their collective bonds to their communities, keeping alive traditions and a sense of future. So now I would like to show you a piece, which I will show you a little bit better in a second, by a Maya Fajardo-Hill artist, contemporary artist called Manuel Antonio Pichilla. He's a fourth of four brothers, and no girl exists in the family. As he was the youngest, he not only helped the father in the milpa, the field, but also the mother, a weaver, with preparing the work for the weaving of textile. Pichilla went to art school and graduated, but decided to consciously create art, a term that does not exist in the Mayan languages or in Fajardo-Hill. And the closest thing to art is the notion of the sacred, but to unlearn the Western training and create art within the symbolic and material values of his own culture. So this post is called Bay Camino, Pathway. It's a handmade textile made with wool, maguey fibers, and cotton thread from 2019. He says, lately my work always relates to my cultural context. In the Mayan calendar, Way, path, is one of the days of the Mayan calendar. It refers to destination of going forward, and that there is both a straight and a windy path that bends looking for an exit on paths underground with unevenness, always looking for lights. And he says, this shape is normally used to actually weave a girdle that holds the women cut the skirts that they wear, the traditional skirts of Mayan women. I'm interested in the material because of the thickness of the fiber of the maguey, and I made a tangle creating strange shapes and different levels of depth in the piece that are a path in life, always look for the light. The textile design is mine, it is not from any region of Guatemala, and I wove it. So I'm going to just show you this for a second, and I would like to pass it on to you later. This is a piece that seems to be quite simple, but if you think about it, you know, the Mayan tradition in textile is an incredible tradition in abstraction. And this particular type of abstraction, which is a design that comes originally from traditional designs, is an invention by Manuel Antonio Pichilla, therefore renewing a tradition in abstraction, in dialogue with the Maya's own traditions and not with Western contemporary art. Is a Moebius type of shape, is a piece that is unruly, is a piece that is disobedient and has this knot. And the notion of the knot for Pichilla is always the idea of something that is tied to the past, but also tied to the trauma, and it can be tied and untied. So this is a piece that for me involves a lot of the issues that for me are present with this notion of the coloniality, something that is art consciously by a contemporary Mayan artist, but at the same time, the dialogue that he produces is not with the canonical notion of Western art, but with his own tradition. So there is something profoundly sort of mestizo that happens here in this tradition, and also, thinking back on the idea of embodiment, because this is meant to be a weaving that is about the girl that it kind of goes around the waist of a woman, is also about celebrating the mother, femininity, women in the Mayan traditions, and it's sort of reverses sort of notions also of marginalization of women as such. So I'm going to actually pass it to Caitlin. If you want to touch it and play with it, you're very welcome. And someone at the end, please bring it back to me. Thank you. The inception of this book may be traced back to 1984 when I traveled to New York on my first alone ever trip in my early 20s to see Van Gogh in Arles at the Met, to then visit MoMA and stumbling into an unexpected exhibition called Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern in 1984. My father was a brown Venezuelan sculptor of humble origin who admired both African sculpture and Picasso, so to a certain extent, I tried to make sense of what I was seeing through his perspective, but the theatrical settings of African mass facing the Demoiselle d'Avignon still haunts me to this day. The conflation of African masks and prostitutes during the Second World War in a seminal work of radical artistic experimentation was terrifying, and I came to recognize absolutely problematical. To conflate a prostituted woman as a sexual fantasy of Western male domination and artistic freedom in the context of a still heydays of French colonialism in Africa and elsewhere is a very personification of what colonialism is both in art and life. The role of the museum in highlighting the drama of this one-way relationship is also the core of the art institution's quest for fetishization of other culture to highlight the achievements of Western art while erasing the rootedness in human beings and complex culture. The reality is that still today there is a hierarchy in art historical accounts and a pervasive invisibility of art expression that do not fit the Western canon in taste, gender, and race, culture, ethnicity, etc. It was 10 years later, after MoMA, that I devoted my MA in London and subsequently my PhD to study the notion of primitivism in early 20th century art. So I became quite obsessed to this notion of how it is that some cultures are classified as primitive and some are classified as modern. Questions about marginalization, subalternity, racism, patriarchalism, violence, dispossession imploded in the early 90s with the cynical celebrations of 500 years of the so-called discovery of America by Columbus and the institutionalization of multiculturalism. So that coincided when I was doing my PhD, trying to work not only on an Afro-Cuban artist called Jose Bedia, but on a Cherokee artist called Jimmy Durham. So this book looks at the past by looking at the present. As you've seen, we've looked also now the present to look at the past. And the idea is really that when you look at the present traces of the past, of life tradition, it's not really the past, it's the past as a present. It seeks the traces of modern and contemporary art history in the ancient when it's alive. The stories in this book do not respond to historical progressive linearity towards modernity and rationality. There is no standard of art historical writing, and nevertheless, many subjects are marginalized in an unspoken agreement of what is worth highlighting. But we live in a time that it seems unavoidable, even necessary, to deal with issues of race, ethnicity, and gender and class. And yet, for much decolonial theory, art is considered to be a privileged cultural form that is not central to the coloniality. That way, we talk about visual culture and other things to avoid talking about art. And further, art history is a colonial discipline and therefore unredeemable. Aruna de Souza writes in 2014, after the Clark Conference Global Art History Turn, I quote, by insisting on the inescapability of the Eurocentrism of art history, such a position has turned back on itself. In other words, insisting that art history is inescapably Eurocentric becomes a policing structure, a maintenance strategy that reproduces its perimeter by insisting that one cannot participate in it meaningfully without simply contributing to its ideological boundaries. This turn then becomes an argument for shoring up discipline boundaries that are under threat of collapse by the unrestrained importation of ideas from other visual traditional disciplines and geographies. But the answer to this paradox for me is simple. There are hundreds, thousands of artists in the world that are deserving to be studied, written about, and exhibited, and that should become part of our imaginary. We need to write specific story from a decolonial perspective, meaning not from a comparative progressive historiography with Western modernism as its measuring stick. The pursuit of the new defines imperialism. This book is about ongoing stories. As Ariela Zulay argues, the potential history of unlearning imperialism is not about discovery, but about constructing together with others. To keep alive the potential to reverse history by reversing histories, I do not mean to imply to raise the colonial past or to return to an unchanged and therefore essentialized pre-colonial past, perpetuating a notion that colonized culture were and are only of value before they were violated and destroyed, an impossible and cynical paradox. Also, I do not want to participate in a program of canceling culture, but in weaving stories that are emancipatory. To write together with others, as this is going to be a collective endeavor, means to work in collectivity with scholars, writers, artists, artworks with purpose. Ariela Zulay talks about co-citizenship, and learning with companions means no longer privileging the accounts of imperial agents, scholars included, and instead retrieving other modalities of sharing the world and the many refusals inherent in people's public performances. So the structure of this book dialogues critically in response to four principles that are the core of coloniality and imperialism. Three imperial principles are time, which entails notions of progress, modernity, linearity of time; space, nation-state, geopolitical formation, colonial expansion; and body politics, the church, the state, societal norms, policies, and practices through which powers in society control, regulate the human body, how we dress, gender roles, the right to abortion, to representation, human rights, racism. The fourth colonial principle relates specifically to art and art history, defined as the evolution of style and taste in Western art, by which much of the art of the non-Western world and the colonized that insist in maintaining alive its pre-colonial cultural and spiritual reference remains unseen or are classified as marginal, second-rate, derivative, primitive, etc. Addressing these four principles, this book proposes four overlapping large themes: histories, demappings or cartographies, embodiments, and materialities. These themes intersect with one another, and at times they may be interchangeable, as one artwork or theme may touch on more than one of all the themes simultaneously. This unruliness, which, while complicated, may be a good thing, meaning that while they may work, they will still not be circumscribing or exhausting the potentiality of the art that we're going to be discussing. So those are, for example, of four works in the four different themes. I will be discussing this later on in the lecture. Time and space and body politics are described by canonical art history in its progressive evolutive structure from the beacon of classical Greece, the Renaissance skipping the medieval times, to the 20th century in Europe, which by mid-20th century included the United States as a key player. All the movements at key periods are protagonized by white men, mostly. The modern part of its history, starting with the Renaissance, coincide with the colonial expansion from the West into Africa, Latin America, the East. Since the mid-19th century, European artists defied academicism. As inheritors of a long history of taste and style, they could destroy, but that was always a resource at their hands, as it happened, for example, for the same Picasso that did Demoiselle d'Avignon. Through the appropriation of African art, the return to order that took place after the First World War, which was a return to classical art, the Puvis de Chavannes, and different themes in order to kind of counter the destruction of the war. So the imagery didn't work anymore. Pre-Hispanic art, for example, or the arts of Africa are excluded from participating in this evolutionary history, which I guess is good. For example, as abstraction became in the early 20th century the central language of modernism, still in 2013, MoMA's exhibition, Inventing Abstraction, 1910-1915, presented abstract art as a modernist's greatest innovation, as a Western metropolitan invention, ignoring and de facto erasing the long history going back many centuries of abstraction in the Middle East, the Americas, and Africa, etc. So this is an example of these extraordinary forms of abstraction which respond not only to different aesthetic codes, but also symbolic codes, which in terms of general terms of abstraction, how we understand it in modern terms, they shouldn't be contained into these forms. Tom Cummins, who is an expert in colonial and pre-Hispanic art, explains about meeting resistance both within and outside the pre-Columbian field to treating pre-Columbian objects as images and images as art. He argues that the debate over whether pre-Columbian objects are art or not diminishes their place in the field of art history, and more often than not, these objects have been confined to natural history or ethnographic museums. As pre-Columbian art and indigenous art is not seen as art, therefore, a modernist or contemporary art rooted in it is seen as less of value. The colonialism in art history requires that all other art to be subservient and dependent to Europe and the white US, and it cannot accept the uniqueness of other art forms in their own terms. So I wanted to show you an example of the employment of old textiles by our contemporary artists from Bolivia. The liveliness of the abstract textile tradition in contemporary Latin American art comes into this collective activation by Gaston Ugalde called Marcha por la Vida, March for Life, which was an installation, a patchwork of various Andean fabrics that the artists collected for more than 40 years, and many of them were collected amongst family members. So they're important. The pieces of variable dimension having been exhibited up to 3 times the size. The work, which in turn is a work in progress, which is continuous till today, alludes to and begins with a march called March for Life, where Ugalde performs an action with the fabric during the largest social march in the history of Bolivia, which was to protest for the rights of indigenous people and their lands in '86. Thousands of peasants who came to the city walked over it as a permanent march for the cultural and spiritual liberation of the indigenous people in Bolivia. And at the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo in Santiago, the piece creates a decolonizing tension against the grain of the neocolonial architecture of the museum, ultimately dominating the atrium space with the monumentality of the patchwork, of a collectivity of geometries and striking colors born of an indigenous aesthetic. As we know, for example, Goethe established that in his theories of color, that bright colors were a demonstration that were only of interest for children and for primitive people. So, for example, here he does a land intervention. He actually makes forms of land that embodies a collectivity within a culture in connection with a reclaimed land, a land with a long history of colonialism, especially Potosi, that was a place that was very important for the exploitation and exportation of silver, and also as a material energy and aesthetic impulse embedded in culture in harmony with land, landscape, and nature. So, the last 2 slides do not stand for an idealized or centralized return to the past, but instead as a dialogical present of past-present in a non-linear history that is still alive. As Silvia Riguera Cusicanqui, she's a Bolivian feminist theorist, explains, the indigenous world does not conceive a history as linear. The past-future is contained in the present. She explains that the contemporary experience commits indigenous people to the present, which in turn contains the seeds of the future that emerge from the depth of the past. She makes a distinction between the past-future of the indigenous world and the forced preservation of the colonial past, which is privilege for the colonizers. If one of the aims of colonialism was to raise ancestral memory, ways of life, spiritual beliefs, imaginaries, and forms of representation of both indigenous and African people, decolonizing the history of the colonization would entail to pay homage and highlight those cultures in themselves or within the fabric of history, a history both of oppression and resilience, and ultimately of creation and resistance. In other words, it means to place the history of resistance in the center, as opposed to the history of oppression as the main narrative, where colonialists continue to have the upper hand. During the 1980s and 1990s, with the so-called celebration of the 500 years of discovery of America, there was a momentary attempt to highlight the oppressed and marginalized culture of Native Americans, African Americans, Native American. But it was done within a controlled agenda of institutionalized framework where we were told how to tell a story of victimization, an imposition of colonial stereotypical perspective, where there was no true agency. One of the requirements of conditional inclusion in official multiculturalism was authenticity, which according to Rivera Cusicanqui is to draw on the theatricalization of the originary condition of people rooted in the past and unable to make their own destiny. She does not consider herself culturally stripped away because she is actually a double origin Aymara and European. She considers herself Chiksi, reflecting on the Aymara idea of something that is and is not at the same time. It is the logic of the included third. She writes, a Chiksi color gray is white, but not white at the same time. It is both white and is opposite black. The potential of undifferentiation is what joins the opposite. Chiksi combines the Indian world and is opposite without ever mixing them. So, and also she talks against terms like hybridity that were made popular by Nerso Garcia Canclini, and also the notion of the melting pot of that started with Jose Vasconcelos in 1925 to express the ideology of mestizaje as the cosmic rake of the future. Normally, these ideas of mestizaje and hybridity end up by portraying notions of homogeneity, where then the kind of singularity of the particular histories of people and where they are within their own journeys of decoloniality or coloniality of histories of their own family, that they don't find themselves. Even though Rivera Cusicanqui is talking here about a society and individual with indigenous ancestry, especially in Bolivia, the notion of Chixi is meaningful also to think about Afro-Latinx and Afro-Latin American art. And it can be activated also within the discipline of art history, that, for example, we may practice this discipline without subsuming culture in difference within the same work of canonical European and North American art, that would always place a perceived outsider, our indigeneity, our gender blackness in a position of subalternity. So Chixi reflects the Aymara idea of something that is and is not, the logic of the third included. So this notion of a third always is a very interesting philosophy that comes across in other thinkers too. I mean, for this lecture, I'm not going to be talking about so many people, but there are incredible theoreticians like Gloria Ansaldúa, who is a Chicana, a writer, and other writers. So histories involve notions of temporality that do not involve progress and modernism, the terms, and sort of the terms that normally are defined, like the archive, memory, sort of is all about counter-history, myth, imagination, non-official history, counter-memories. As this history involved a decolonial impulse, they embody notions of healing, resistance, resilience, survival, independence, and invention. The temporality in history, and for that in the whole book, is the notion of the future perfect, which sounds much better in French and Spanish, which is el futuro anterior. The anterior has sort of a notion that is embedded also in a sense of a past that is becoming. It is a past of the future of the past. Of the action will be in the future relative to the present of the past. We may think of the coloniality as a verb in action. Instead of a category or a term, the notion of the previous future comes from Lacan, who from psychoanalysis describes it as an unresolved personal history or trauma, colonialism, human rights. Rosalind Douche uses it as a way to describe the potentiality of feminism. The future anterior means looking at the past from the continuous actions of the present and the future. It will be like this: what we will have been by what we are in the act of becoming. And this, we will have emancipated, or emancipated will have our body in the act of emancipation. And this applies to the notion, for example, of ending patriarchalism, vindication of forms of sexuality, subjectivity, ethnicity, imagination. That is, to propose a non-linear dialectical temporality which recognizes the past, its erasures, its traumas as an inconclusive process, but as a becoming in our process of revindication, liberation, humanity, so the potential of emancipation. So this image that I have here is called Building a Simulacrum of Power. Funnily enough, when you write the nationality of the artist next to the name, it says New S 1981. So for a Chicanx body, a queer, he actually doesn't even identify as Chicanx, as brown body. This is a crazy thing. I think this illustrates very much the kind of the tension that there is with this idea of nation, state nationhood. So this was built on top of Michael Parker's the unfinished, a shallow trench cut in the pavement that outlined the ancient Egyptian archaeological site known as Unfinished Obelisk. He invited four brothers, his sister, and his parent to assist in the making enough adobe bricks to cover the entire 137 feet long obelisk. For approximately 3 weeks, the bricks were molded and dried on site using water from the LA River. This is also meaningful for him because, the territory here, it used to be a Mexican territory, and the way that this river has been completely contained in a cement structure, there is something quite terrible, this kind of post-industrial place that became a reclaiming of the land, of the water, reinscribing it as a place of gathering labor of making adobe bricks that relate to his father, who is a Mexican immigrant. He works traditionally in construction of adobe homes. So it is also about Brown in the site. It's about ritual, collectivity, family, and friends. The closing performance, which is what we're seeing here, is there were 4 dances. Choreographer Rebecca Hernandez slipped in and recrossed the trench, while Esparza performed a traditional Aztec danza. The danza Azteca is actually really popular among Chicanx people. So he's been doing this for many years. So he dresses in the Aztec attire at the obelisk bait with loincloth, pheasant feather, and ankle rattles. And then he crawled after dancing around the obelisk, 40-meter lengths of his belly, which you can see on the bottom slide on the left, to reach in the tip and strip down his jockstrap and straddle it, literally sort of in an act of making love and queering the monument. This is at the end of the ceremony. He actually dressed up in normal clothing, blue jean and a jacket, but then he still left his feathers on his head and then lit sage to finish sort of the ceremony of this sort of browning and this generation of a space that is both brown, queer, and communitarian. So thinking of, I'm sorry about the slide on the right-hand side, the Christian subject, Christianity, is a very important one. The Cristo Favelado on the right, I've just put it as an example to contrast with the Juan de Mesa Christ from the 16th century. Is a piece that was actually produced for the Teatro Experimental do Negro, organized by Abdias Nascimento, who's a very important figure in Brazil to reivindicate a sort of a Pan-African vision in Brazil. Confronts the lack of representativeness and dignity of Black people in the national performance art. This was the role of the theater between 1944 and 61 in Rio de Janeiro. It caused controversy at the time, and it was accused of attacking both religion and painting, as Christ is represented as normally a white man. This is Black, and also the Black Christ appears here crucified and homeless, and instead of the Roman tormentor is the federal district police officers, reminding us out to this day the extreme violence of the state against Black people in Brazil. So I'm showing you these images also because they talk about a history, but also they talk about a present. They're relevant. So the idea is that this historiography is an ongoing historiography that kind of helps us think of ourselves in the present. For example, Sidney Amaral. This is an artist that was deceased quite young, but also he, in his work, addresses historical themes and the structure of slavery in Brazil and its continuation in the present. The slavery in Brazil was abolished in 1888, but still marks the exclusion of a large part of the community of Black population in Brazil. But also in the works that he also makes, there is always clues of the continuity reverse of the status quo. So proposing an affirmation of the Brazilian Black against the history and the reality of oppression. So you can see that, on the one hand, it refers to the choke, but on the other hand, there is a microphone. There is a microphone which doesn't have a lot of agency, but there is a potentiality for agency. Or Jaime Lariano, Libertade, Libertade, reproduces the drawing of a book, The Penitential Tyrant of Slave Trader Reformed. But the book, instead of actually having a descriptions of these elements that were used in slavery, for example, the color as instrument of torture, what he does, he replaces the original text for 2 passages of the national anthem of the Republic of Brazil that actually completely whitewash the history of slavery, therefore sort of bringing back. And it's sort of complicated when we deal with this kind of iconography because it seems that it's an iconography that has to do with victimization. But when there is trauma and there is issues that are unresolved, if there is no acknowledgable something has happened, you need to revisit the past to move into the future. So it's sort of a dialectical situation. And it's also about caring to tell the story. And this caring, I think, is a very important. And I'm interested in creating a dialogue with Ken Gonzalez-Davis, a Chicano artist dedicated many years to research for a book called Lynching in the West, 1858-1935. In the US, it was believed that the only people that were ever lynched were Black people, but he actually demonstrated very clearly there were also Asian people that brought, but especially Latinx people. He himself is a queer Latino. He says, the resulting series of photographs were created to help me cope with the history of racial hatred that has taken place in California landscape and is an invisible history, and to raise awareness of a history of a mistreatment of Latino in a continuous situation, if you think of the border situation now between the US and Mexico as it continues. It's very interesting to see in the images that these are photographs that he actually found, because there used to be postcards to announce the moments of the lynchings, and people would go as a kind of great spectacle. But he erases the bodies of the lynched persons. So what we have is the trees, we have the body languages of the people. There isn't this kind of re-victimization of the body. There is this kind of a silent moment of testimony of something that had actually happened. Or for example, something like Sildo Meireles, which is a very important piece from the 1980s, which you can see how it's made, is a work that comments on the human cost of missionary work that happened in Brazil and its connection with the exploitation of wealth in the colony. The ceiling is composed by 2,000 bones, while the floor comprises 1,000 coins, symbolically joining these two elements as a column of 800 communal workers in the center. This conflation of power, death, money, and religiosity on the Christian side has been an incredibly strong conflation. You know, the missionary came to save indigenous population from cannibalism, things like this, ended up by literally exterminating a lot of them. But I mean, it's interesting also in the way that this piece works, because on the other hand, it's a horrific idea, but there is something incredibly sort of beautiful that is contained in this sort of almost sacred space that talks about this sort of death, massive death that happened as a result of colonialism. Or someone like Rosanna Paulino, the permanence of structure, that creates this kind of collage structures with the symbolic representation of colonization of African people, is a representation of the voyage of slaves, as you can see in the ship in the center where the slave used to be brought in, and different iconographies, like, for example, typologies of black body that were used also to create a typology of inferior races, and mechanism of racial classification, and so forth. So there is Atlantico Vermelho, the Red Atlantic, is sort of, again, these are works that talk about. So Wilfredo Lam from Cuba, The Jungle. So this, again, so normally abstract art is represented within the notion of modernism. In the book is going to be actually represented through the idea of being part of an ongoing history of sort of survival of African and indigenous cultures in the cultures of the contemporary, in the creation of a different type of imaginary. I think I'm actually already sort of more or less running out of time, and I'm only going through one of the subjects. I won't have a lot of time to read these images, but the point is, you know, this is talks about that sort of these two works are embedded in African Santerias and also Yoruba cultures. And, you know, Ruben Valentin, this composition is impossible to read this work in the normal modernist terms, because it's actually composed in a way to narrate a story based on symbols that are spiritual. Or someone like Niobe Chandot that also worked with the idea of creating these sort of abstract masks that were sort of also trying to talk about the notion of orishas in Afro-Brazilian. Or for example, in a case such as this with Margarita Azurdia, who is a Guatemalan artist, because one of the issues that we have is that on the one hand, we have an indigenous artist like Manuel Antonio Pichilla, and on the other hand, we have an artist like Margarita Azurdia, who is non-indigenous, but is also Guatemalan, raised all her life with a indigeneity that permeates every aspect of culture. These same things happens, for example, with African culture, how it permeates in Brazil, it permeates in Cuba. And in this case, she makes a decision to create an abstraction in relation to the abstract tradition of the Mayan, and also this type of patterns is related to particular symbologies that have to do with community and the sort of the central squares of the indigenous people. And for example, here in this other series of Las Guerreras, which is homage to Guatemala during the Civil War, which was incredibly cruel and terrible, especially to women, indigenous women, she creates this sort of mask, this sort of ceremonial, covers their body in this sort of textile pattern, and then gives them weapons to defend themselves. It's sort of a power, sort of an exercising attitude. Also, there was an incredible tradition a very important tradition in Latin America with indigenismo, which happens early on in the 1920s and 30s, which was about not only reivindicating the rights of indigenous people, not so much denouncing, but reivindicating them, but also creating a notion of the avant-garde based on the indigenous past and indigenous present. Artists like Joaquín Torres Garcia and Rosa Acle, both of them created a particular works that are a conflation between a form of what was called universal constructivism, a sort of a work of within a structure of a gridded structure that it was then traced with all the symbologies that had to do with symbols that trace back to indigenous, for example, architecture, Inca symbology, and so forth. So I wanted to explain a little bit the notion of the mapping. For example, here, Joaquín Torres Garcia, one of the gestures that he did when he returned from Paris was to invert the map of America into this sort of upside position. So the South ends up being the North, as we would normally would call the North, because as you know, everywhere in the world, the South is always sort of subsumed to the idea of the past. So, but the maps are way perspective to share a purpose of their makers, and they're normally meant to be neutral, but they are actually serve the political values of territorial demarcations and their symbolic depiction. And if we look at the history of mapping in Latin America, when it started to exist after the so-called discovery of America, it was embedded with iconography of cannibalism and so forth to create this sort of sense of this virgin line that could be exploited, and it was fascinating and so forth. So thinking of this type of symbology is just no wonder how artists have actually used mappings in order to rethink of national territory. For example, Sandy Rodriguez, who's a Chicana artist, she created a specific codex, a new codex called Rodriguez Mondragones, which is a name based on the Codex of Bernardino de Sahagún from the 16th century, which when was translated into Spanish, everything was described was pro-colonialism, but when it was in the Nahuatl language, was actually describing a lot of the atrocities that were actually taking place. But it's in a mate paper, which was eventually forbidden from being used by the indigenous people, which was a paper that they used to do their own codices. But then is inscribed with she done a lot of research about not only pigments that were used originally in the pre-Columbian codices, but also plants, but then embeds into here the narratives of the sort of la migra, the problem of migrations and the violence that happens in the border, and the pieces on the left-hand side, the double portrait was done during the time of the detainment of and the separation of children at the border between Mexico and the US. And this particular child that was only 1 year old actually died in the hands of the migration, became ill, and there was nothing to be saved, and the mother is 20 years old. So, but she inscribed this tragedy with this kind of figure that is kind of almost like a pre-Hispanic grandmother, and it has this plant is a kind of a generic name for a healing plant in Nahuatl, Nonchlon. Ken Gonzalez-Day, to go back to this project, apart from kind of recording all these images of lynching and finding all these progress, he dedicated several years to actually try to find where this lynching had taken place. So where he found the trees, for example, in the case of the second garrote, this was actually a real tree. But in the other one, some of them are invented. But the idea is that they're sort of witnesses, but it's this sort of caring, it's sort of a cherishing act of actually inscribing this notion of landscape. For me, this has to do with the notion of mapping, because it's remapping a territory through this idea of reclaiming a history and caring for this history. Or for example, Armando Reveron, who in the early 1920s sort of created this very interesting form of landscape painting, which is literally the dissolution of the landscape through the action of the light. This is the Caribbean light. So it's a very, very particular form of light that we may think of the Impressionist, but it's the motives behind it wasn't really the light itself, was this kind of dematerialization of the landscape. I wanted to spend a minute on this piece by Annabella Geiger because this is a piece that has transformed the idea of the amulet to the amulata, a black woman, to the muleta, now I can't remember how it's called, in, when you're actually limping, and to the notion of Latin America. And this piece was read many times by many people as actually a piece that was actually stereotypical because it was equating the amulet and the black woman, the limited role of the cliche as a cultural identity. But for me, this is incredibly colonial. I would like to read instead this piece as actually an identification with the map of South America as a land that may be feminine and black, that may be identified with a religion that is not the Christianity, and there is a syncretic place that instead of being this kind of white notion, so this idea that we may think of a map like this as actually a sort of a map that is a cliche of something instead of thinking that is actually an empowering map. Lea Lublin is an Argentinian artist that created this incredible experience called Fluvio Subtunal, which is another form of mapping. It's mapping an artistic space where it's possible. She created all these different zones, a technological zone, a production zone, sensorial zone, the uploaded zone, this whatever. So basically it conflated all the different aspects of life in one single place. And it was completely open. And even though it had all these different zones, that you were completely free to kind of move around between this. And I think for me, it's very interesting because it invited participation, personal creativity, nature. People could basically more or less do whatever she wanted to do. And for her, it was a notion about replacing formalism and that it was a necessity. And she wanted the concept of an open work. We know about the open work through Umberto Eco, but in this case, it truly is a completely immersive situation. It was totally open. It was participative not only to the art people because it wasn't in an art space. Everybody came here, children came and played. But also there is this very interesting area here, which is the fluvio, which is this membrane of transparency, which is in the central, which is radical within the work. The transparency represents the artist's ultimate aim, not only that the public will become an active and living element of the artwork, but that the separation between the interior and the exterior, the inside and the outside, would disappear, thus also blurring one of the essential roles of map and rationality, which is demarcation. Secondly, it concerns both the body and the embodied experience of the participant. Lublin was a feminist artist with a keen interest in the place the body occupies in the history and society. In 1995, she said, "The phallic cylinder into which one could enter by separating two inflatable air columns, two lips, as if one were entering a vagina, was transformed into a phallus vagina, which condensed the dual sexuality that dwells within us." So she was able not only to collapse this kind of notion of conductivism and the separation between science and art and experience and different publics, but also this notion, collapsing the notion of agenda, which is always heterosexual, defined as opposed to being also possessing some sort of duality. I won't have time to go through these ones, but basically these are forms of massive mapping subjectivity in terms of how a map works. So, the relationship between the individual and what happens with the environment that surrounds you and the different relationship, paternal and societal. And Fidalay Baez, I'm particularly fascinated by this piece by a Dominican artist who actually plays on this series La Ciguapa, which is a mythical figure that is supposed to be a kind of a monster that is sort of works with their legs going backwards and is sort of hypersexual, has a lustrum mane and so forth and so forth. And there was all this sort of always this idea that if you can may encounter this creature, something terrible may happen. And for her, this encounter may allow you to be silent enough for entering a space of civility as opposed to a space of the opposite thing. And for her also is idea of self-possession and she inserts this figure which has between the monsters, but this monster becomes something also incredibly beautiful. And a lot of these things that she does on maps and on flora and fauna were trying to debunk the ideas of this. Anyway, I don't think Carl Linnaeus, who invented a lot of horrible taxonomies for the Caribbean, which were incredibly racist. So materialities and collectivity, this is a complicated discussion, but it relates closely to the notion of the vernacular and popular culture, crafts and material culture, defies academic principle of style and aesthetics, and is often connected to collectivity and community. The term popular here does not have the traditional association with pop as with mass or consumer culture, but rather, as Gerardo Mosquera, a Cuban writer, explains, equivalent might be grassroots or community-based. In pre-capitalist culture, the popular can be pointed to a set of living practices, possibly a whole way of life. In a contemporary urban setting, it would describe the level of culture that derives from the streets rather than the academy. And also in Latin American art and Latinx culture, the division between high and low is never being completely in the same way that we see it in the US or in Europe. Ticio Escobar, who is a very interesting writer and also runs a museum, he was one of the co-founder of a museum that actually shows next to each other indigenous, popular, and high art, as if it were. And he actually describes that there is a parallel between the way that the avant-garde developed in Latin America and popular art, and he says that there are parallel scenarios where they constitute the most propitious place for which to resist the concerted aestheticism of the global hegemonic culture. But also he talks about this cultura de abajo, from the below, from the low, excluded from power. But he thinks of them as non-hegemonic fields, as locus, not a fixed subject, an objective, not a name, where there is no dichotomy and there is no essentialism. He never believes in this idea that there is such a thing as a pure craft or a pure anything. He talks that they're insubordinate areas of cultural logic of the planetary market. Once again, this does not mean imagining uncontaminated areas, but marking contingent points of location. So basically, the idea here is that the popular as a form of resistance, and if we think of, for example, something like Pichilla that we saw at the beginning, there is a conflation with what we would understand as popular art or a craft, like as a textile, and in a way is embedded into something that it can be in itself interesting and also something else. For example, the arpilleras were a movement led by Chilean women during the Pinochet dictatorship. They met weekly and they produced also in dangerous situation, embroidered realities of oppression, hardship, and everything. They actually were doing this work during a time that nobody dared to reject authoritarian rule, a time of self-control and obedience. And they were the first women to create a culture of resistance. The first person to actually do work in arpillera was Violeta Parra, who is better known as a poet and as a singer. And so she was the first person, and also the Molas from the Panamanian, from the Guanayala, the Guna people are also one of the influences into this work. You can see here the type of iconography that is done, sort of the type of work of denunciation, which reminds of the Madre de la Plaza de Mayo. This is Silvia Menchuda, Asociación Andencan. This is in Guatemala. It's a group that started to actually embroider as a result of Teresa Margolles coming to Guatemala and being disobedient to her orders to embroider images of violence, all in black and white or gray and white, and they decided to embroider images of joy and quetzales and things in community, and they discovered that by embroidering in community, they were able actually to discuss a lot of the issues and produce these incredible tapestries. The point wasn't to embroider well, the point was to come together as a community. There is especially in Chicano culture, there is something called the Rascuache culture, which has been theorized in a very interesting way by Tomás Ibarra Frausto. He talks about Rascuachismo is neither an idea nor a style, but more of an attitude or taste, is an underdog perspective, a view from Los de Abajo, rooted in resourcefulness and adaptability, yet mindful of stance and style. On both sides of the border, is this kind of bicultural sensibility amongst, Mexican American. Funnily enough, the fact of what Chicanx people pride themselves to do this kind of, create this kind of mestizo type of syncretic forms of expression is the reason why they are completely marginalized everywhere, especially in California, where I normally reside, and I'm working on a big project on Chicanx exhibition to sort of counter this notion. And this is a lowrider's car. For me, the lowriders, I've always been fascinated with cars, but for me, they've been described as cathedrals on wheels. Rubén Ortiz Toro, who is a Mexican artist, now considered Chicano, also calls it the revenge of Montezuma against Mondrian. But the issue is that in the 1940s, they converted the greatest technology car done for the perfect American family to go into the suburbs into something that had a hydraulic system that made them jump and run and dance and cover the surfaces with, like here, with Mexican roses, with drippings. They put the upholstery with kind of kitschy kind of velvet and fake flowers. So it was considered an American thing. They were even forbidden from circulating along Whittier Boulevard. And for me, they're very powerful because also the way they intervene, in America, North America, we don't have plazas, the square where you reunite. So they will come in a bunch and the community will fall around them. This is a Chicanx artist that did a lot of photograph of lowriders cars, and Judy Baca creating this Tres Maria piece that talks about these kind of Chicanas, Cholas, Pachucas, and in the center there is a mirror where you have to view yourself in this social fabric, which normally is marginalized, but the whole piece is upholstered as a lowrider's car. Amelio Basemain turned the notion of the rascuachismo into domesticana, sensibility seen from the female perspective that discusses notions of kitsch, the day-to-day experience of Chicana working class women, turning the domestic tensions of the body and the bedroom in the kitchen into the altar. So she makes all these sort of ofrendas related to different aspects of culture. Or Guadalupe Maravilla, who is a Salvadoran artist that came to this country illegally in the 1980s, then had cancer and then developed as a result of that and as a result of curing himself, this series of sculptures, which are also sort of healing machines. That's how they describe them. They're a series of freestanding sculpture functioning as hairdressers. You can actually wear them as a hairdresser, therapeutic instruments, shrines, and bridges the issue of affectivity and justice. Is made with assembling materials and objects that he collects, walking across several times between the areas where he migrated between El Salvador across all the way into the US. They're very, very powerful machines, and he activates them in public events of healing. For me, they're very interesting because the whole notion of utopia that is associated to Latin America, utopia, El Dorado, riches, the exotic, for me, turns around into this notion of utopia, is turning art into something that can actually have all these different roles and function within the fabric of society. During the COVID, he actually had several of these into shelters for immigrants and will just do healing sessions for calming people. I don't really have a lot of time to talk about these pieces, but these are Afro-Brazilian artists that also embed in their works notions of the sacred, and I wouldn't do a lot of justice to the Didi, which I have a reading, but is not mine. And in the case of Sonia Gomez, patois is normally, considered to be like a form of, is a bundle, the stitched, that normally has sacred objects inside. So they are also a way of relating to the matrilineal grandmother, and for her to consider them a fetish is not a problem, and they relate both to Afro-Brazilian culture, to the notion of patois, to grandmother, to psychoanalysis in Western art history. Eder Kalel, this is a Guatemalan artist that created this installation with stones. All these stones are pretty much sacred for them as an indigenous person. The materiality is always all embedded in something. Is important, and it's not any stones. And he makes this sort of offering, which is called the abuelos, for the grandfathers. There is always this very important notion of cherishing your ancestors. And is an offering to thank the grandfathers for all the struggles and sacrifices they underwent to pass on to us, to leave us this heritage of great riches, because it grants us the ability to communicate with sacred times and spaces. This is him speaking. So I'm going to briefly go through the embodiments, which is the last theme of one of the most complex one, I will say, involves performance, self-representation, notions of intersectionality, race, gender, performativity, body, agency, resistance, queerness, and feminism. Also the embodiments of forms of sexuality, which are non-normative, spirituality, and cultural specificity. For a framework of embodiment, I refer to José Esteban Muñoz's notion of feeling brown, a term that is not an identity per se, but a function as a coalition term that unites cultural and political activists across different national, racial, class, and gender divides. For Muñoz, what unites and consolidates oppositional groups in feeling brown is not simply the fact of identity, but the way in which they perform affect, especially in relation to an official national affect that is aligned with an hegemonic class. So the idea is that affectivity is shared amongst the people, and normally the status quo does not profess affect. Even though Esteban Muñoz is referring specifically to Latinx and queer people, the notion of affectivity may be embraced for thinking of disobedient forms of desire, embodiment, and affection in both Latinx and Latin American artists. The key importance of Muñoz's feeling brown is that it describes a form of political doing and becoming, whereas queer or not, when an individual performs a non-hegemonic, non-normative, and unregulated form of affect. This brown affectivity is experienced by identifying with other brown bodies. José Esteban Muñoz also uses the term identities indifference, which I think is very interesting, to describe emergent identities constructed by disidentifying with the mass public and instead, through the disidentification, to contribute to the function of a countersphere. So I find that this is very interesting because normally when we are actually fighting for our rights, we have like an enemy. So we counter-identify with that enemy. And that sort of relation of power is often unequal because we don't have the same amount of agency. So disidentifying and create new identifications with the people with whom you can create a community is a very powerful way to create, for him, a third model of dealing with dominant ideology and transforming the cultural logic from within it. For example, Carlos Mota, who was a homoerotic historiography, created this series of miniatures, silver sculptures, which were golden, of pre-Columbian images of homoerotic acts. And also, if you can see, the images are not very good. So we're displayed in these kind of tiny little, in these windows, in this dark environment, sort of also to relate to the idea of constructions of desire, and also in the way that we have actually censored this type of iconography. Because, as a queer artist himself, he tries always to reclaim and go back to moments in the history of America when it wasn't colonized, but these forms of what we understand forms of sexuality were actually normal, or were part of kind of. For example, Sebastián Calfuqueo from Chile, he's also a Mapuche artist from Chile that also in here does a very interesting operation where he uses this ethnographic photograph of a naked indigenous and a photograph of a white woman, with this image of purity, but also this sort of erotic gaze, and places himself as a third woman, as a queer body in the scene to talk about this kind of long history of erotization and also sort of way of oppressing the female body. Martín Gutiérrez is a trans Latina woman of Guatemalan indigenous origin that created a magazine called Indigenous Woman because she found that there were no indigenous women in fashion. So she creates these very interesting images, also playing with sort of ideas of stereotype and also fantasy. The notion of imagination, for example, the quetzal feather, this sort of is not an essentialist thing. It's sort of a combination of different ideas. So she talks about, I'm working in conveying my own fluid identity, an identity that bridges the binaries of gender and ethnicity. I aim in part to subvert cis, white, Western standard of beauty and raise questions about inclusivity, appropriation, and consumerism. Giuseppe Campusano is a very powerful queer figure that is already deceased. He's was especially interested in transvestism, and then he has a museum, a transvestite museum. He said, I see transvestism as a ritual, like a priest performing a liturgy or a shaman of the native cultures. And Miguel Lopez says, understood as an analogy to the mask, the false, the copy, the camouflage, transvestism started to be a useful analytical concept capable of visibilizing and philosophizing the process of colonization, resisting hybridization and mestizaje. So one of the things he did, he actually created this special suit, which is very powerful to look like an appearance of a virgin. He will just go into different places and people will actually think that it was a virgin that was appearing to them. So she was looking for in cross-dressing as a Virgin Mary, he was looking for an incarnation even more powerful than the whore. It was when I transformed from an erotic whore into an ecstatic virgin, like a kind of Marian post-porn icon, like words or devices that we can embody, emptying them to fill them with other meaning. I exercised the transvestite body, word, icon in that sense, starting from his most visited facet to his other lost in the memory. So this is Mujeres Creando, because the whole idea, there has been a whole movement in Latin America, the idea that, we need, in order to have freedom, we need to have sexual freedom. Sexual exercise demands freedom. This is Mujeres Creando. For example, they say we cannot decolonize without depatriarchalized. Neither the earth nor the women are territories of conquest, or no woman is born to be a whore. So they're playing into this. Is a Bolivian group, and I'm interested in Maria Lugones, that talks that there is no decoloniality without decolonizing gender. She writes, legitimacy, authority, voice, sense, and visibility are denied to resistance subjectivity. In our colonized, racially gendered, oppressed existences, we are also other than what the hegemony makes us to be. We're never simply oppressed subaltern being, and here we are beings to inhabit a fractal locus constructed doubly, who perceives doubly, relates doubly, where the sides of the locus are in tension, and the conflict itself actively informs the subjectivity of the colonized self in multiple relations. She proposes an active subjectivity as an exercise of resistance. So this is a Chilean artist that sort of establishes this kind of horizontal line of the body on the facade of this neoclassical museum, which is a museum of contemporary art in Chile, to actually sort of talk about this notion of the body as being in sort of a space that is sacred and it needs to be, has sovereignty. Issues like maternity, Maria Vela Marmolejos, who we saw in the first slide, proposed, giving birth as the greatest act of creation of an artwork, and actually consider the whole upbringing of her son, Sesquilé, as the continuation of this great artwork that still continues today. Or Lea Lublin, who was a super conceptualist artist that proposed, to spend a whole month that she was participating in this exhibition at the Musée des Beaux-Arts, just upbringing her child, sort of eliminating the stigma of maternity. Or Maria Elisa Magnani, who is an artist, Afro-Brazilian artist, who started working in the 1960s. Her work focused on the human subject, depicting contorted, afflicted, and fragmented bodies to denounce women's oppression, racism, and violence, also during the dictatorship, but especially towards Afro-Brazilian women. It's noisy, one. So this is a piece that, I'm about to finish the presentation, is a piece called Fuga by Dora Longo Bahia, Brazilian artist. And for me, intersects many of the issues of the book. For example, this brush mark that you have here is actually there to remind us of the Cold War and the sort of the whole rhetoric of abstract expressionism, that coincided with the Cold War, the Plan Condor in America, and also with the notion of violence towards the the Black body in Brazil, especially in recent time, that the violence has actually become. So she talks about revealing the violence that is implicit in abstraction. Her brushstroke is not only an index of her action, but is woven collectively within the history and sounds of violence against women. Indeed, the word fugue refers to a musical composition in which one of the two themes are repeated or imitated by successive entrance voices and so forth. When she did this exhibition, every 10 minutes, which is every 10 minutes, a Black woman is killed in Brazil. The same woman that we saw now was actually screaming in the gallery. Or James Luna, that actually embodied himself as a dead Indian, and people will poke him and everything, and actually lay himself with his favorite books and music, and people actually believe that you would actually display an indigenous man in such a way. Or someone like Martin Chambi in the 1920s, that as a photographer created a different way of portraying indigenous people. You can see here these two different forms of self-portraiture, himself as an indigenous person and himself as a person, looking at his own photographs, no longer, sort of westernized as it were, or you have, the family with the crop at the top, and then you have the indigenous person with the motorbike. So this kind of, if you think of Curtis' photograph of the whining, Native American, he wasn't, he portrayed both the traditional aspect of the indigenous people in Peru, but also the people who, the mobility and the transformation that was actually taking place. And for him, he was actually intent in representing his race and actually dispelling the notion of their inferiority. This is my last slide by Belkis Ayon, who was an Afro-Cuban artist. And even though, it doesn't involve directly the body, but it does involve a notion of an identity, she explored, starting in 1985, the Abacoa, an all-male secret society brought to Cuba in the 19th century by slaves from Nigeria. She traces Sican, which is the figure that you can see the white figure in there and the figure sitting on there, from life to death and eternity, transgressing the traditional narrative of fraternity and female betrayal to privilege a woman's perspective. Using colography, which is a very interesting method, for example, in the supper, is one of several images that interweaves Abacoa and Christian symbolism to reference both the Abacoa initiation banquet and the Last Supper, replacing the central figure of Jesus with a stark white Sican flanked by several black and gray women as apostles. Thus, by rendering the event with women usurping the roles of men both in the Christian and Abacoa tradition, the black and white bodies signify not race by life and death, respectively, in Abacoa mythology. At the heart of Ayon's work is the Princess Sican, the only woman in the Abacoa lore who was put to death for revealing the religion's secret to her fiancé, a prince in an enemy nation. In Ayon's work, nevertheless, Sican remains alive, and her story and representation figures prominently the whole time. So here on the right-hand side, the image where she's sitting in a frontal position in a throne-like furniture, the stylized figure of Sican appears magisterial with her wide-eyed, defiant gaze and her mouth. Ayon wrote herself, "I see myself as Sican, in a certain way an observer, an intermediate, and a revealer. Sican is a transgressor, and as such, I see her and I see myself." Thank you.